Welcome everyone to Professor John Minford's second virtual talk on Hong Kong literature and translation. Before I hand over to Professor Minford to start the talk, I'd like to remind the audience that after talking for about an hour and a half, Professor Minford will receive questions from the floor. Those who want to ask questions, please type in your question so that Professor Minford will see your question in the chat box. And after the Q&A session, before you log off Zoom, please fill in the evaluation form by clicking the QR code. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Minford. Professor Minford.
Well, thank you, William, once again for being my personal contact man and general helper and wonderful friend from many years ago. And I'm very glad to be here again on a Saturday evening. It's now the evening in Hong Kong, New Zealand. A very, very cold day, a freezing day today. But I'm looking forward to taking over where I left off, basically. And if you remember, one of my key beliefs is that the main aspiration of all translators is the concept of friendship in the traditional Chinese sense of zhiyin, knowing the sound. And the ideal translator knows the sound, can hear the voice of the person he's translating. And that is a very close concept to the idea of friendship. And that's going to be my recurring theme throughout these talks. But let me try and get my PowerPoint working. Hang on, I'm not very good at this. I start share, okay. I think that's it, yeah, okay. Now, I've been giving this second talk a great deal of thought during the week, because although the subject matter remains basically the same, I've come to think rather differently as the days have gone by. And so I've given the subtitle to this talk. I've called it The Plight of the Translator, in the light of translating two very eminent Hong Kong writers who I've had the great privilege and honor to work very closely with over the past 20, 30 years. And those people, they will be very familiar to you. They are, of course, Jin Yong or Zha Liangyong and Ye Si or Ya Si Liang Bingguan, both of whom I worked very closely with over the years. And very, very different writers, very, very different people. But I have been the same in the sense I've been their translator. And what does that mean? What is the plight of the translator? And I had this idea because I was remembering a very wonderful friend of mine called Oldrich Kral. He was a Czech sinologist, the student of the great Jaroslav Prusek. And Oldrich got into serious trouble when the Russians invaded Prague, back in those days, and lost his job and so on and so forth. But when things got better, he came back with a vengeance, and he's the most wonderful translator. He's translated Hong Lao Meng, he's translated Jinping Mei, Yi Jing. In fact, he and I have been following each other around the world for many years, and we are very close friends. And once, in fact, in Hong Kong, at a conference, we shared the same hotel room, and we corresponded a great deal. And I've always been a very great admirer of Aldrich. And some years ago, when there was a conference in Taiwan on translation, and he came and he gave a talk which virtually nobody understood except for me, because I completely knew what he was talking about. Aldrich was a friend of the very famous Czech novelist Milan Kundera, who went to live in France and thinks of himself now more as French than Czech. But Aldrich was his friend, and he had some of the same ways of thinking. And he gave a talk on what he called the existential plight of the translator. I can't possibly repeat everything he said. It was a wonderful talk. But in a way, that's in the back of my mind as I take you through the story of how I worked with these two very eminent Hong Kong writers. The two Hong Kong writers where, of course, this face is familiar to everybody in Hong Kong. Jin Yong, the great martial arts novelist, the great public figure, the great tycoon, and so on and so forth. And then the other writer that I'll be talking about is is Liang Bingguan Yesi Yasi PK. I always call him PK, and in this talk I shall simply refer to him as PK. I could go on and on about that name. It's a wonderful name that he gave himself, but I think time is short, so I'll just call him PK if you don't mind. Now, the rough chronology behind this is that I left Hong Kong. Now, I want to sort of get rid of all these people on the right here. Well, I click this thing here probably. That's it. I left Hong Kong in December 1986 to come and live in New Zealand. That was the first time I ever came to New Zealand. And I didn't go back to Hong Kong again permanently until 1994, although in between I made many visits. I visited almost once or twice a year. I couldn't keep away from the place. But so I've listed here the periods in which I went back to work and live in Hong Kong. They were 1994 to 99, 2004 to 2006, and then again more recently in 2011 and to 2013. Now, we more or less left off last time with the publication of this special issue of renditions, which I started putting together in 1986, and I continued to guest edit it from New Zealand. I was by that stage what they call editor at large of renditions, and that came out eventually in 1988. And looking back at that time, in the few years before my departure from Hong Kong, I think it was quite a very interesting time for renditions, because we launched a series called Renditions Paperbacks. They'd never been done before, and with the help of my friend Johnson Tang, who is a great art dealer and always dresses very nicely, and he was very helpful in terms of giving us ideas for design, and he lent us the use of his art gallery for various meetings and so on. So Johnson was a great friend and help at that time, and he introduced us to the art of Louis Chan, Chen Fusan, whose paintings grace a lot of the covers of the renditions paperbacks, and of course of the special issue, because I think Mr. Chan really captures the mood of Hong Kong of his lifetime. He was a very interesting man. I met him. I went to his 80th birthday party. A fascinating individual, a real original. He liked nothing more than playing mahjong. I mean, he was not your sort of pretentious modern artist, a very rough and ready kind of guy, but his paintings are absolutely wonderful. Now, at the same time, we had a wonderful stroke of luck, because the director of the press, of the Chinese University Press, where I worked, was a man called T.L. Jim, a very, very dear friend of mine, who I saw again only a couple of years ago in Hong Kong. And there we are having a wonderful meal. He brought the most extraordinary bottle of wine. He's a great connoisseur of fine wines, but he's also a free spirit and a very inspiring publisher who encouraged me to do all the things I wanted to do. And when we launched Renditions Paperbacks, the two editors of the series were myself and him. We were the joint editors, and he had a wonderful experience as a publisher and a very smart guy, and he helped me a great deal. So here's one of the books. You see, we did a book of CC's stories. We were the first people really to translate and publicize the wonderful work of this lady CC, and that's one of Louis Chan's pictures, of course, on the cover. And that was republished later in an extended version with extra stories. And we also published stuff from the mainland. We made quite a stir by publishing this 冬天的童话 by Yu Luojin, a rather shocking story from the days of the Cultural Revolution. And we collaborated closely with the author in Peking. And this was an interesting book. These are all books in the Renditions paperback series that came out in the mid-80s, before I left Hong Kong. And this was actually a book by a married couple who worked at the university. He was English, he was from Cambridge, and she was a Chinese lady from Suzhou. And they jointly wrote this autobiographical memoir. And I like to see that, in a sense, as a forerunner of the memoir which we included in our new series by Leo Lee and his wife. It's a wonderful, this was a great book. Now, not long after I left Hong Kong to go and work in New Zealand, and I became the professor of Chinese at Auckland University, my great friend and mentor, Professor Liu Tunren, he very much encouraged me to get involved with Jin Yong, with Louis Cha. And before that, so had Stephen Sung. They both said to me, you would find his work very interesting. And it was largely as a result of Stephen Sung Chi, and Professor Liu that I ended up meeting Louis Cha in his office and becoming his translator. It was a bit like being the royal court jester. I felt incredibly honored that he agreed to let me translate his work. At the time, he was at the height of his wealth and power. He was still running Mingbao, and I went to meet him. I went to meet him early in 1989 in his office at the top of the Mingbao building in North Point. And it was like having an audience with the king, really. His office was about a mile long, and it had really sort of smart French provincial furniture and rows of books, mostly his own books, of course. And he waved his hand and showed me all the translations he'd refused permission to. And then he said, because of Professor Liu and because of what he said about you, I want you to be my translator. And this was after he started off in the film business, and this is early days. And this is Stephen Sung, he was the one who, you see, Stephen Sung was an incredibly perceptive literary critic. And he was one of the first people to say to me, you've really got to take this guy, Jin Yong, seriously. He's pretty interesting. And Stephen wrote quite a lot about him. He wrote an article based on an interview he had. And in that interview, he said these things. He said, in the Sung dynasty, there lived a poet called Liu Yong. And in his time, there was a popular saying, wherever there is a well of water, you'll always find people who can chant the poems of Liu Yong. Today, we can say likewise, wherever there are Chinese people, wherever there is a Chinatown, you'll find the novels of Louis Cha. And these are Stephen Sung's words in an interview that was published in 1969. And Stephen wrote a lot of essays about Jin Yong. He found him very interesting. And that was exactly what Professor Liu said to me when he was talking about him. He said, 这个人非常有意思, very interesting. And that's always it's a bit like the French saying, cet homme est très spécial, he's very special, So I was prepared for some interesting experiences, but they weren't quite like the ones I actually had. But that's the story I'm going to be telling. Now, this is my comment really on Stephen's remark. And this is me writing in 1994, by which time I'd got to know him a bit. And I said, walk into a bookshop in Hong Kong, Taipei, Singapore, or stop at a bookstall in Peking, Shanghai, Canton, or any Chinese city, and make a note of what the really engrossed browsers are reading. The chances are it will be one of Louis Cha's novels. Stroll through the stacks of a Chinese studies library in a Western university and see which shelves show most signs of being used, which books are most higgledy-piggledy, thumb-marked, missing, in a word, read. It'll be the martial arts fiction section. And within that section, the shelves devoted to Louis Cha's work. It's not just the young and the middle-brow readers who are addicted. I've encountered over the years the most amazing variety of Cha aficionados, elderly professors of Chinese archaeology and linguistics. Johnson Chang once said to me, John, I graduated from the University of Louis Cha's novels. Somewhat of an exaggeration. Modernist poets writing in Chinese. The well-known poet Gu Cheng couldn't stop reading Jin Yong. He read him all the time. And they don't want to read plain old-fashioned Chinese prose, but they do find Cha's work addictive. Now, how can this be explained? What is the Jin Yong mystique all about? Stephen Sung offered 3 reasons. The first was the way his novels recreate the quintessential Chinese spirit or world, a mixture of elements taken from Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. So in other words, he's purveying a kind of smorgasbord of Chinese culture. sort of popularized. The second is his recurring concern for traditional Chinese ethical values, loyalty, piety, humanity, and honor. And the third is his fluent prose style, his Baihua. His Baihua one is very, very fluent. This preserves the essential beauty of Chinese prose. It is timelessly Chinese. It has not been corroded by the un-Chinese Western sentence structures that have so overwhelmed many Chinese writers of this century. He's thinking of people like Ba Jin, Mudan. Of course, the one thing one has to remember about Jin Yong, about Louis Cha, is that he comes from a very, very distinguished literary family. His ancestors go way back into the Ming dynasty, and they were men of letters and calligraphers and painters. The shuxiang, the fragrance of books, permeated his family, and he inherited that. But he also learned, he studied very hard. He was a very hard-working person. The other thing one has to remember about Jin Yong is that he was also a businessman. He was he was very good at making money, and he had a very hard-nosed business sense. I realized that as the days went by. Now, in the case of Louis Cha's novels, quite apart from the nature of the genre, their popularity has, I believe, a lot to do with the author's personality. This is me speaking, by the way, in a publication, and his own perception of himself, not as a pretentious writer of serious literature, but as a storyteller in the Chinese tradition, whose aim is simply to please, to entertain by creating first-rate stories and vividly imagined characters and situations. And this is Louis Cha. Since childhood, I've enjoyed reading martial arts fiction. I write such fiction first and foremost for my own pleasure, and then for the pleasure of my readers. So in other words, he saw himself in the early days as a traditional storyteller. And it's a very demanding business, storytelling. I mean, some people are very bad at telling stories, but he was a storyteller. And so basically he said, I'm just a storyteller, like the professional storytellers of the Song dynasty. I just want to bring my stories to life. I want them to be gripping, exciting. And he says at the bottom, I believe martial arts fiction, that's wuxia xiaoshuo, is like Peking opera or ballad singing or dancing or music. Its main function is to give pleasure. It does not necessarily have a great deal of artistic value. Now, this is what he was saying early on in his career. He rather changed his tune as the years went by. Towards the end of his life, he started having more pretentious ideas about his role as a writer, ideas with which I was not in tune. And in fact, we had quite an open disagreement about that. You see, when I first encountered him, I reckon that he was more or less like the great Alexandre Dumas, Père, the father, the one who wrote all those lovely novels like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. Superb storytelling, but not he had no axe to grind. He wasn't a pretentious thinker. But later, and at first, I think Louis Cha was quite happy to be compared to Alexandre Dumas. In fact, it was a very complimentary thing. But later in his life, he started to think that really he was like Victor Hugo. Now, Victor Hugo is a quite different story altogether. He was a great master. He was a poet, a painter, and of course, a novelist, Les Miserables, and so on. And a really important heavyweight. He's almost like the Goethe of France, you know, really great. And later on, I think it was unfortunate that Mr. Cha wanted to see himself as a kind of Victor Hugo of Chinese literature, which he certainly wasn't. Now, it was really Stephen Sung who introduced me not just to Jin Yong, but to his last novel, Lu Dingji. And several friends actually said to me at different times, you really ought to read Lu Dingji. That's the one you'd enjoy, because it's not a typical Wu Xiao Xiao Shuo at all. And this is what Stephen Sung had to say. He's a fantastically good literary critic, Stephen. He wrote this: I remember some years back when The Deer in the Cauldron, that's Lu Dingji, was running in Mingbao. I encountered Louis Cha, and inevitably our conversation came round to his new work. I expressed my great admiration for it and said I thought it was the most wonderfully radical new departure, in a strange way reminiscent of the new novel in the West. Trinket, that's Wei Xiaobao, is an anti-hero, and the novel itself is an anti-traditional martial arts novel. On the surface, there's a great deal of genuine historical content, but beneath it all lies a subtle humor and satire, somewhat like Alexander Pope's mock heroic. As the serialization of the novel progressed, I saw how far its richness and originality, its subtlety and brilliance exceeded all my earlier expectations. Not only was this vast work anti-martial arts, anti-chivalry, it was also anti-Louis Cha, as seen in his previous work. It was a roller coaster packed with thrills, with fun, rage, humor, and abuse, written in a style that flowed and flashed like quicksilver. And then there was the character of Trinket, that embodiment of laziness, that inexplicably charismatic, riveting rascal. You see what a wonderful critic Stevenson was. He was the one who really got me all interested in Jin Yong and in Lu Dingji. And Cha himself said this. He said, one of the reasons for the popularity of my novels is their Chineseness. They describe Chinese society, Chinese people. They have, for this reason, been well received in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese influence is so strong. But I wonder, and this is a very important thing, I wonder if they will ever be much enjoyed by Western readers. There are no English translations as yet, but whenever I have retold the stories to Western friends, they don't seem to be particularly interested. I think he put his finger on it there. It's very, very hard. And that was what I had to confront as a translator. Very hard to make these books, which are so loved by Chinese readers, come over into English at all. It was a huge challenge. And it was that challenge that really got me excited, actually. And here's the complete works of Louis Cha. I mean, my goodness, you need to be a strong man to lift those up. I've got the complete works. This is a later edition, but anyway, basically, as a result of Professor Liu's very kind, he wrote a letter to Louis Cha saying, you've got to get Minford to translate your stuff. He's the guy, and he was very sweet. And I signed a contract with him in 1990 when I was still working in New Zealand. And then over the next sort of 10 or 12 years, I produced, with help from others, the 3 volumes. The first one came out in 1997, and then the 2 later ones came out in 1999 and 2002. And this was pretty much how I met him in his Mingbao office in North Point. A very, very charismatic individual. I mean, I suppose I was a bit cheeky. I didn't really find him very, very intimidating. I just, I was a bit of a liumang myself, you know, and I just wandered in and said, okay, well, I'll translate your books then. And he showed me all his book. His office was just lined with mostly copies of his own books. And at the time, you know, Professor Liu, there he is again. I showed you that picture last time. He was my unren. He was the guy who really helped me. And when the first volume of Lu Dingji came out, Jin Yong wrote this little preface thanking Professor Liu because it was his 80th birthday. And we wanted to thank him for, you know, giving him so much encouragement and so on and so forth. So once again, these 2 people, Stevenson and Professor Liu, were there always in the background of my life. In fact, they were like propelling me forwards, really. It was part of my yin yang, you know, I couldn't resist it. And I thought at the time, God, this is wonderful. Look at me, I'm looking so pleased with myself. How awful. I hate that photograph. And at the time I was teaching at the Ligong at the Polytechnic. And I got a grant from the Research Council to set up a kind of reading group. And this was fascinating. So I got 4 young graduate ladies, very nice people. Just we'd get together once a week, and they would read they would work their way through the Jin Yong, you know, oeuvre, and they'd watch videos and things. And then we'd have a meeting, and I would discuss with them what it was that they found so fascinating. I was trying to learn, you see. I was trying to get the taste of it. And we would sit there, we were looking at Shedia Ying Sung Duan actually at the time. And they were typical Jin Yong readers, you see. It's always been young people who really get hooked on Jin Yong. And these were my students, and they helped me a great deal to get the general idea of what it was all about. And then later, almost as a counterbalance to this, I met a very lovely lady called Margaret Ng, and she was for a time the senior editor at Mingbao and very close to Jin Yong. And we became very close friends. And she started teaching me a great deal because she had been very close to Jin Yong, and gradually over the years, she'd become rather disillusioned with him. And we met for many meals and discussions, and she taught me a huge amount. She published several books of essays about him. Here's one of her books, you see, and here's another. And anyway, she was helping me to have a broader view of this very complex, very fascinating man, very, very talented. And anyway, in October 1997, we finally had a big launch party for the first volume of the translation, and it was held at the China Club, which is, as you probably know, is a pretty swanky place at the very top of the old Bank of China building, full of modern Chinese art and lots of kitsch and sort of culture. I find it quite distasteful, but that's where the press wanted to have the launch. And the head of Oxford Press from Oxford flew all the way out to Hong Kong to be there. And I was standing next to the great man himself with our, flowers and everything. And I'd had my hair cut that morning by my son, who was very naughty. He just took a pair of clippers and more or less shaved me bald. I think he was trying to make a fool of me. Anyway, we had a very lively press launch. There were about 20 television cameras. That was when I first realized quite what a hot media figure he was. Everybody was hanging on his every word. And I was just a kind of, I was just playing a bit part. And that was when I first started to realize that for Mr. Cha, the translator was just a kind of walk-on part. It was a kind of lackey, really. And I think therein lay the problem of what happened subsequently. Over the years, I produced the second and third volumes. Of course, his original Chinese book was in 5 volumes. And to cut a long story short, I reduced it to 3 volumes because I thought it was much too long and repetitive. And in this, I was guided by my old collaborator and teacher and friend and father-in-law, David Hawkes. Now, what happened was, in the winter of 1991, I was living in southern France, and I was starting to work on Lu Jingji, and David Hawkes came to stay with me. And I just by chance left a volume of Lu Jingji lying on the dining table, and he picked it up and he just started reading it. And he just said, "My goodness, this is fun. What on earth is this? Who is this man? Who is this man? Jin Yong never heard of him. He'd never heard of him." And he said, this is rather nice. It's a bit like reading Shui Hu Zhuan or something. Yes. And then he said, "Well, what's going on? What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to translate it, but it's rather a big undertaking." So he spontaneously said, "Well, would you like me to give you a hand?" So suddenly there and then, I'm just trying to get my, how do I do this? Oh yes, there I am. Suddenly I had a collaborator on my hands, and David decided he wanted to get involved, but he said he didn't want his name on the book, but he'd give me a helping hand. And he started translating at least half the book, actually. Now, so anyway, eventually they brought it out a couple of years ago in Hong Kong in a kind of 3-book paperback box set. And so obviously they've decided it's worth keeping it in print anyway. It doesn't sell very well, but I mean, it was certainly, and David and I had what I would call an unusual and sometimes uneasy collaboration. Now, this is the contents of the first volume from my personal copy. And I've got written on the right-hand side, DH, it means David Hawkes. That means he translated the prologue, and JM is me. I translated chapter 1, 2, 3, and so on. So in fact, I'm the only person who really knows which chapters were translated by him and which chapters were translated by me. So over the years, David and I worked. He'd already finished his work on Hong Lao Meng, so he was at a bit of a loose end. So he got very involved in translating Jin Yong, very involved. I've still got about 50 letters from him about the whole experience, and some of those I want to share with you. And in 1997, let me try and minimize this, get rid of myself. In 1997, David came to Hong Kong, and Jin Yong took us out to lunch at the wonderful old restaurant on the top of Mandarin called Pierrot. It was a French restaurant. And we had, of course, the most delicious meal. But as you can probably tell from that picture, David wasn't exactly in a very good mood. There was no chemistry between him and Jin Young at all. It was most unfortunate, really. And this is another picture from that meal. And they didn't get off to a good start. There's the lady, that's his widow, his wife May, and charming lady. And in fact, David wrote a letter in very wonderful sort of classical Chinese, more or less saying, I think you better not take me too seriously. I'm just an old man having a bit of fun. And anyway, over the years, he wrote many, many letters to me about translating Jin Young. And this is what I want to share with you, because I've never really shared them before with anyone. And he says, this is at the end of one letter, he says, I must say I'm somewhat underwhelmed by the way in which our author, he capital O, capital A, has stitched together the different narratives which make up chapter 1. To give only one of many possible examples, there's absolutely no reason why the time of day has suddenly become the middle of the night in the concluding part of the chapter. But perhaps it won't show. Translating is such a slow way of reading a book that I suppose it's not really a fair test of its plausibility. So he was already from the very beginning starting to find problems with the book. And at the bottom of this letter, he says, well, he starts off by saying, Dear John, I defy anyone to make a plan of Oboy's prison, which would make sense of the narrative. So he points out in that paragraph that it's physically impossible what's going on. And then at the bottom, he says, KY, that's the short for Gamyung, is an incredibly vivid and imaginative writer. But I get the impression that he just forges on, correcting nothing and probably not even reading what he has written. After parting with the bowl of stew, e.g., Trinket is still left with a bowl and chopsticks on page 267. I've assumed that it's okay to tidy things like this up as you go along. In other words, this is a scholar of incredible brilliance who's worked with Hong Lamang and dealt with all different texts and so on, with an incredible sense of detail and a very, very fine translator. And he was tearing his hair out about the laziness with which Jin Young was writing, because he was writing for a newspaper, 1,000 words a day kind of thing. And often he couldn't remember, I'm sure he's right, he couldn't remember what he was saying before. Now this is a later email from 2001. I think it's worth reading the whole thing. The whole water cannon episode in chapter 47 is so ridiculous, I don't quite know how I shall manage to handle it. Has Louis, he spelled it wrong, has Louis Cha. By the way, he's called himself Louis Cha. I think I was the first person to be told this in honor of Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the writers he really admired. Has Louis ever tried melting snow in a wok? How much? For how long? Using how much fuel? Or ever used a spray gun in his garden? You don't remove the plunger and pour water in the back. You draw it in through the nozzle end, etc., etc. Anyway, halfway down where I've underlined it, this isn't magic realism, it's baby stuff. Too soppy for kung fu loving adolescents, I should have thought, especially if at the same time you're supplying learned notes on Russian history. And then he says at the bottom, shall I handle this with whatever fudge I can think of, or have you something in mind? You may feel it's best just to clench one's teeth and play it the way it is. I defer to your judgment. We did have a very tricky collaboration on this because, of course, Professor Hawkes always regarded me as his student. And on the other hand, I was actually like the lead translator in this project. So we clashed quite often. I wanted to write things rather differently. And here he says, halfway through, I think all the geography in this chapter is pure fantasy, along with just about everything else. There's hardly a paragraph that doesn't pose some problem or other. Was there a beach or a landing stage on the island? Could you really jump from a skiff into the arms of someone on the deck of a battleship? Could you really ride on the back of a sicker deer, which is slightly smaller than medium as Dogo, or even on a much larger one? Could you really light a wood fire and roast venison on it in the snow, etc., etc.? Of course, he ends up, of course, this is Boy's own stuff. And Jean, that's his wife, says readers don't notice, but I'm not so sure. Robert Louis Stevenson does work things out a bit. you can be sure that our Lewis was never a Boy Scout. And there's more and more, all the letters are like this. I think for students of translation and for students of Jin Yong, the letters would be very, very interesting, make a very interesting read. Now, here are some very, what I call very practical thoughts about translating wuxia xiaoshuo. I mean, there's nothing sort of theoretical about this. It's just stuff that I've done, which I found helpful, which I think students would find helpful as well. And one thing is that I always, whatever I'm translating, I always compile a list of books I ought to read in English, which might help. And when it came to translating Lu Dingji, I started writing down a list in my notebook of books like Hereward the Wake. And I particularly liked George MacDonald Fraser's wonderful historical jokey books about Flashman and the Dragon. I like the Three Musketeers. So this is a list of all the books I read, and I read many more to get into the style of what I would call popular historical fiction. Some of them I had read as a boy at school, but some of them I read from scratch. And when I read them, I would make notes as I go along. For example, this page here is taken from Flashman and the Dragon. And so every time I find an interesting expression that I thought might be useful, I just note it down in my notebook. And I think it's a very, very useful practice. I would recommend it to everyone. And just by comparison, this is the same thing I did for Liao Zhai. I made a list of the books I ought to read in English to help me get into the mood. And then I would and there's another list there, yeah, of tales of the supernatural, and some of the Henry James and all these people. These are the kind of things I had to read. And it's not just about learning understanding the Chinese, it's about being able to write. And then another part of the preparation for this job is finding ways of extending one's vocabulary. I came across a wonderful book in the Hong Kong Polytechnic Library called A Dictionary of Medieval Knighthood and Chivalry. And I've still got it. It was very, very useful. First of all, it had wonderful pictures of helmets and armor and swords and weapons of one sort or another. And that you need to have a lot more words at your disposal than an ordinary person does when you're translating wuxia xiaoshuo, because there's lots of weapons and armor and all kinds of stuff. And another thing that I had to do for this very long and demanding project was to write a detailed synopsis of the whole book. I think my synopsis came to about 70 pages, and I was able to share it with David. And it went something like this. I would just go through page by page, summarizing everything this is chapter 1, you see, and this is chapter 31, and this is chapter 38. So I went through the whole book with page numbers and just basically summarizing the plot, summarizing what happened, because it's a very long novel and one tends to forget. And here I put a big green cross saying, can we skip the horse stuff? Because there's an awful lot of nonsense about horses, which I think was quite boring. And that brings me to in fact, I'll pause there for a moment, because when Hawkes and I were working together, he said to me, John, we can't do this the same way as Hong Lam Meng. This is popular stuff. We've got to abridge it. And that was what Jin Yong really didn't like about what we did. He didn't want his work to be abridged. But David said, we've got to abridge it. It's far too long and repetitive. And he said, sit down, I'll show you what we do. And he opened the book on the table and he said, okay, chapter 21. We'll read chapter 21, we'll read chapter 22, and then we'll put the book aside and we'll just sit back and we'll retell it as one chapter. In other words, incredible freedom. This is from somebody who'd already worked on Hong Lam Meng, somebody who had very high standards, but he knew how to recognize popular fiction when he saw it. And that's how we came to abridge it. And so when later Jin Yong was not happy with the abridgment, I had to tell him it was entirely David Hawkes' idea. And I did, but I thought he was right. And so our translation was an abridgment. Another thing I think one has to do with something like this is to do a great deal of background reading, not just fiction, but actual information. And I have a wonderful old copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It belonged to my grandfather. It's the 1911, the 11th edition, wonderful. And I used to read it all the time. And for example, I looked up the entry for fencing, because the closest thing we've got really in the West to martial arts is fencing. And I read the whole article very carefully and made notes on it. I also would read Chinese background information here about the Tiandi Hui, about the triads, because of course, there was all sorts of stuff I didn't know about the historical background and the social background. And then maps. It's very useful to have good maps. I found a wonderful map of the Forbidden City. And you can't see my notes, but I made notes on all, because a lot of the action in Lu Dingdi takes place in the Forbidden City, because one of the themes in the novel is the friendship between Wei Xiaobao and Kangxi Emperor. Now, so this is kind of moving along. I'm working very hard. I'm trying very hard to get things finished. But meanwhile, Cha himself is entering a new phase of his life, because whereas his work used to be banned in the mainland, as Deng Xiaoping establishes his power, Deng Xiaoping himself was a great fan of Jin Yong. And so one of the great moments in Cha's life was when he went to Peking and met with Deng Xiaoping, and the picture was all over the newspapers, and there they are. Look at Deng Xiaoping, and look how pleased Jin Yong is looking. He's so delighted to find that, you know, he's got a fan in high places in Peking. And then not long afterwards, he met Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin became a friend for life, because he once said to me, I can really talk to Jiang Zemin because we both speak Shanghai Hua. They both prefer to speak Shanghai Hua. I mean, Jin Yong was never very good at speaking either Putong Hua or Guangdong Hua, but his Shanghai Hua was quite fluent. And now, in my relationship with my author as a translator, it really went through a crucial phase in the year 2000, when the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to a Chinese writer called Gao Xingjian. And incidentally, one of Gao Xingjian's best translators is the dean of the translation school at Hang Seng University, Gilbert Fong. And Gao Xingjian was awarded the Nobel Prize. And the citation read, for an oeuvre of universal validity, bitter insights and linguistic ingenuity. Now, it so happened that in that year, Jin Yong was nominated and was very keen to get the Nobel Prize. And his friend Jiang Zemin sent an envoy all the way to Stockholm to speak to the member of the Nobel Committee who was basically in charge of Chinese affairs, Göran Malmquist, who was one of my predecessors at the ANU. And Malmquist was not at all pleased to be pressurized by Jiang Zemin and told what to do. And I think largely as a result of that visit, he ended up proposing to give the Nobel Prize to Gao Xingjian, who was a friend of his and whose work he had translated into Swedish. And later that year, I was in Hong Kong, and Cha invited me for lunch at one of his favorite restaurants called Amigos in Happy Valley, which is a very, very luxurious and wonderful restaurant. The menus are about 3 feet high and no prices on them, that kind of place. And we had a rather sticky meal, actually. It didn't go very well. And I realized after a while that he was not in a good mood. And he just said to me, John, we are not pleased with you. I said, well, what do you mean? I said, what have I done wrong? And who's we? I said, anyway, who's the we? And he said, the we is myself and Jiang Zemin. I said, oh, really? What's the matter? And then he put the entire blame for him not getting the Nobel Prize on my shoulders by saying that Malmquist had said he wasn't eligible because I hadn't finished translating Lu Dingji. So he was very cross with me. And really after that, our relationship deteriorated quite badly. And it never really recovered. I mean, I think I did fulfill my obligations. I was slow in delivering, but I tried to get a very high standard. But he was never very pleased with my translation. And that was a turning point. And he was a man who loved fame and honor and public acclaim. And later in his life, and this is really, he went to Cambridge to study. And he was given an honorary doctorate, but he wanted to become a real doctorate. So he actually produced a PhD. And this is a picture of him with his supervisor, David McMullen. And he got an MPhil, but he subsequently got a PhD and became a true doctor of philosophy. Now, I want to end this little section on Jin Yong. How are we doing for time? 6:45. Okay, all right. I want to end this section on Jin Yong to put him into a perspective, to put him into a broader light than just Hong Kong by talking about a cousin of his, a member of the Jia family, a very, very fine poet called Mudan. And it's also a transition to the second half of my talk, which will be about Yasi. And this is the young Mudan at Chicago with his wife Zhou Yiliang. Now I've had dinner with Zhou Yiliang in Tianjin. She was a professor of biology at Nankai Daxue, and that was where Zhao Liangzheng, whose pen name was Mudan, that was where Zhao Liangzheng also taught. Now Zhao Liangzheng had a very, very hard time in China. He was persecuted during the anti-rightist movement. During the Cultural Revolution, he was treated abominably, and he died a very, very sad death towards the very end of the Cultural Revolution. A tragic, tragic story. And when I had dinner with his wife, his widow, and somehow the name of Jin Yong came up, and she just said, "I'd never want to hear that name mentioned in my presence." And I said, what's the trouble? She said, well, we wrote to him so many times for help when Mudan was in trouble, and he never even replied. He did nothing for us. So it's a very sad reflection on the two worlds that existed at the time, and also the two branches of the Jia family, because Mudan belonged to the Tianjin branch of the family, and Jin Yong belonged to the Haining branch, so they were north and south, but they were still cousins. And to conclude this section, I want to just share with you the most wonderful poem by Mudan. Mudan was a truly great writer. I mean, one of the great poets of the 20th century in China. Probably, in my opinion, one of the 2 or 3 greatest of China's poets from the 20th century. And this is one of his finest poems. And William, I think I've given you the Chinese text for this, haven't I? I think on yours, I corrected, on your copy, I corrected all the Jianti, but on this one, I'm afraid they remain Jianti. So you'll have to bear with that. So if you would mind reading the whole poem, I think, in one go, and I will follow on the screen here. Okay. Thank you, William. In Cantonese, of course, yeah.
Okay, yeah. 我已走到了幻想底盡頭，這是一片落葉飄零的樹林，每一片葉子標記着一種歡喜，現在都枯黃地堆積在內心。有一種歡喜是青春的愛情。那是遙遠天邊的燦爛的流星，有的不知去向，永遠消逝了；有的落在腳前，冰冷而僵硬。另一種歡喜是喧騰的友誼，茂盛的花不知道還有秋季，社會的格局代替了血的沸騰，生活的冷風把熱情鑄為實際。另一種歡喜是迷人的理想，它使我在荊棘之途走得夠遠。為理想而痛苦並不可怕，可怕的是看他終於成笑談。只有痛苦還在，它是日常生活，每天在懲罰自己過去的傲慢。那絢爛的天空都受到譴責。還有什麼彩色留在這片荒原？但唯有一棵智慧之樹不凋。我知道它以我的苦汁為營養，它的碧綠是對我無情的嘲弄。我詛咒它每一片葉的滋長。
Thank you very much. Now, this is the translation which I did with a couple of friends. I'll talk about them later. The Song of Wisdom by Mudan. I have reached illusion's end in this grove of falling leaves, each leaf a signal of past joy, drifting sear within my heart. Some were loves of youthful days, blazing meteors in a distant sky, extinguished, vanished without a trace, or fallen dead at my feet, stiff and icy cold. Some were boisterous friendships, flowers in full bloom, but ignorant of the coming fall. Society contained the pulsing blood within its grid. Life cast molten passion in reality's mold. Another joy, the spell of high ideals, drew me through many a twisting mile of thorns. It's no pain to suffer for ideals, but oh, to watch them change into an object of scorn. Nothing now nothing remains but the agonies which punish me daily for my past pride. When the glory of the sky stands condemned, in this wasteland, what color can survive? There is one tree that stands alone, intact. It thrives, I know, on suffering's blood. Its green shade mocks me ruthlessly. Oh, wisdom tree, I curse your every growing bud. Now that translation was done primarily by a very dear friend of mine called Tang who passed away a couple of years ago in Melbourne. And this photograph was taken of the two of us was taken in Melbourne a year before he died. A most remarkably wonderful Chinese intellectual who was a very close friend of Mudan's and translated all of his work into English. And we worked on this particular poem together back in Hong Kong in the 1980s. And it was subsequently published in this book called 100 Modern Chinese Poems, edited by Pang Bingjun and by myself with a friend called Sean Golden, Gao Deng. And there's Sean, who's currently has taught for many years in Barcelona. And so this goes back in time to that period in the 1980s that I talked about last time, in which there was a really wonderful sort of cottage industry at the Chinese University Translation Center. And I was able to invite people like Pang Bingjun, people like Sean Golden to come and work on projects like this book of poems, for example. And one of the results was the translation of Mudan. And at the same time, Sean Golden was working with a former student of mine called Zhu Zhiyu on the poems of the mainland Menglong poet Gu Cheng. So there was a lot going on in the 1980s. And that was before I encountered the whole Jin Yung phenomenon. And later on, these Pang Bingjun and Liang Bingjun, of course, they have the same name, Bingjun. They met in Hong Kong in 1996 and became very good friends. And that's a wonderful picture of Yasi, of PK, with these two friends of mine in such a good frame of mind. And so now I think I'm going to start the second part of my talk. I think this would be a good moment to have a very brief 2-minute break to allow people to get up and stretch their legs or whatever they want to do. And then I'll come back. I'll come back in 2 minutes. I make it 6:53 here in New Zealand, so it'll be about 2:53, yeah. Yeah, okay, 2-minute break then. Okay, then let's carry on. So now I come to the second part of my talk and the second person in my talk, and that is my very dear friend, the poet, PK, or Yasi Liang Bingjun. And it's a very different story, very different person, very different kind of literature. And we're no longer dealing with a kind of charismatic tycoon. We're dealing with a very private person who, of course, was very involved in the public life of Hong Kong, but in a very different way from Jin Yung. In fact, the two of them really had nothing in common at all. And these are just photographs, some of which I've been sent by Betty, his wife, who's been so helpful to me throughout. And we were very good friends. And I think if anyone understands the work of PK, it's Betty. My wife once said that she didn't know anyone who had a louder laugh than PK. He just laughed his way through life in an incredible way. And but he was also capable of being very, very melancholic and very, very sad and very. I can't say enough how much I love his poetry. It's probably of all the poetry I've ever worked on, the poetry that speaks to me most intimately and deeply. And recently, about 2 years ago, and it was Betty who sent me this. There's a 2-volume anthology of his poetry over 50 years, put together in Taiwan by Taiwan University Press. It is the classic reference now. And in all my work, I followed this text very carefully because there have been so many editions of his work, and he was so prolific and sometimes so generous in just giving away stuff that it's good to have this very, very authoritative collection in 2 volumes published in Taiwan. Very well done, with a long introduction by Ye Lim, Ye Wei Lian, who was a very close friend of his. And I think I want to emphasize at this point that it was PK who inspired the whole new Hong Kong literature series, and the whole series, which is behind all of these talks. The 6 books that have come out are really his children. They're the one. He was the one who really got the ball rolling and started the whole thing off. And his concern for the literature of Hong Kong to be recognized for what it was worth was so deep and so sincere. It just drove him right up until the last days of his life. He died very, very prematurely in early 2013 of lung cancer. It was a tragic loss for Hong Kong literature. He was too young and he had so much to do. Now, in the series, partly because I like his work, partly because he was the one behind it, we actually devoted 2 whole books to his poetry. This is the book of his poetry called Lotus Leaves, which I personally edited and much of which I translated myself. And then the 2 of his stories in a separate book, which I entitled the book Dragons, because both stories have to do with dragons of one sort or another. And I've chosen 10 of his poems. This will, I think, be the meat in the sandwich of my talk. These 10 poems I've chosen very carefully. I want to read them to you, and 5 of them I've given the Chinese texts to William, so he'll be able to read the Chinese for us. And the remaining ones, I'll just read them in English. So we'll begin with what I think is one of his greatest poems called Cauldron, which is quite clearly a symbol. The cauldron is a symbol of the handover of ceremonial power from the colonial British to the new Peking authorities, what he called the new colonial authority from Peking. So William, if you would kindly read this first poem in Chinese, and then I will read the English. Thank you very much.
結束了崩潰的王朝，慶賀一統天下，號賞群臣制定禮樂，並且鑄造青銅，銘記新的典範與權勢，彬彬守禮的盛宴隆重排開，貴族長者坐在席首，騷動的野獸主城沸騰，安盛大典之中，端莊文明的鳳鳥民。 取代猙獰的獸面，我們卑微的腸胃經過太多反覆，飽餐歷史，狼吞傳說，永遠的飲宴留下填不滿的空白，在不斷改變的制度中，我們逐步變成我們厭噬的食物。由於害怕遺忘，我們吞下所愛的人，咀嚼記憶。 機場碌碌，我們望向身外。青銅的輝煌閃爍，扣住眾生的仰望。征伐荊楚，君臨中原之外的野網。萬人呼喊要界外的李族俯首稱臣。柳之金石，啄之盤魚，處處鏗鏘的歷史。飽煙趙令有傷脾胃。 食具也太沉重，我可否放棄盛宴的肥膩，改進素羹，煮我的野菜與你一爐共野？可會調整你的威嚴，逐步變出新的文式
Thank you very much, William. And there's a good old cauldron. And here's the translation, which was one I did a long time ago, but it probably needs revisiting. So as the Zhou dynasty rebuilt the empire and celebrated the unity of all under heaven, courtiers were honored, ceremonial music composed, metals melted, vessels cast, new injunctions set in bronze, power revalidated. The grand banquet commenced. Noblemen and elders took their places of honor, while savage fauna bubbled restlessly in the cauldron. A sober phoenix motif replaced the gruesome mask of the beast. Our humble bellies have ingested a surfeit of treachery, eaten their fill of history, wolfed down legends, and still the banquet goes on, leaving an unfilled void in an ever-changing structure. Constantly, we become food for our own consumption. For fear of forgetting, we swallow our loved ones, we masticate our memories, and our stomachs rumble as we look outwards. Creation's aspirations are trusts caught tight by the luminous bronze. In his campaign against the true, the southern state, as the emperor approached the wilderness beyond the central plain, 10,000 bawled for the rustics beyond the pale to make their low bow of homage. Stone and metal engraved, vessels fashioned, tintinnabulations of history. The proclamations sit heavy on the stomach, destroy the appetite. The table is altogether overdone. May I abstain from the rich banquet menu, eat my simple fare, my gruel, my wild vegetables, cook them, share them with you? Is there a chance your pomp and circumstance could ever change, evolve slowly into a new motif, some new arabesque of beauty? It's a very sad poem. I mean, it's written in 1996, before the handover, but he's already taken on board the significance of that event. And then this is another early poem, which I've called Leaf Contact. Again, I think, did I give you this one, William? I can't remember. I think so.
Yes.
Could you read this one again, please, in Cantonese? This is a very early poem of PK's. He wrote a whole series of poems. Hello? Sorry. He wrote a whole series of poems. Yeah. Anyway, you go ahead, William.
偶然來到這蓮田，沿一塊舊木板走入葉叢，靜默摩擦靜默，發現出聲音。這是奇妙的，綠色回答綠色，相遇在這世界的早晨。風吹開那邊閉合的簾，牽動我這兒捲曲的蓮緣。我們將會接觸，開始笨拙地解釋。葉上言語所能照明的脈絡，是我們僅有的世界。早晨逐漸混圓的新路，令我靜止我的沉默，又感染另一塊葉，同樣承擔一隻昆蟲棲停的重量。偶然相遇在這世界，並排可卻沒有刻意安排拘謹的韻腳。我們發出同樣的聲音，又失去彼此，在風中互相試探，還不如自然探索，意義會逐漸浮現的。重重葉上的霜雪仍然令我沉重，長自同樣淺窄的水中，努力直立以一支中空的圓梗，伸向一個更真實的空間。我知我們不能離開這世界的言語，但也不是要附和它。當我們沉默，那裏仍充滿聲音，各自忍耐季節的灰塵，一面傾聽書開的時候，可以感知遠方水的顏色。
Thank you. I just want to say a brief word about the influences that PK had. I mean, he wrote his PhD at the University of California, San Diego, on the work of Mudan and his contemporaries in the so-called Nine Leaves. And he was very much influenced by that school of poetry that kind of emerged in the late 40s in China, and then subsequently had no real future under the Yan'an doctrine that literature must serve the people. And Mudan was one of PK's favorite poets, and in some respects his poetry resembles Mudan's. And in this series called Lotus Leaves, there are very metaphysical discussions of a whole range of topics, including personal relationships and the way people see each other and the way they have trouble making contact with each other and the subtleties of one individual's perception of another. Anyway, here's the translation. By chance, we come to this lotus field, walking an old plank into the thick of the leaves. Silence, rubbing silence utters sound. This is a wonder, green answering green, an encounter in this morning of a world. There the wind blows open the closed faces. Here it sets in motion my cusped leaf edge. We shall make contact and begin clumsy explanations. The leaf veins which language can illuminate are the only world we have. The fresh dews of morning which gradually grow round make me still. My silence touches another leaf, each bearing alike the weight of an insect at rest. A chance encounter in the world, side by side, with no intentional prosody. We utter the same sound, then drift apart, rather than explore each other in the wind. Raise our heads naturally, meaning surfaces gradually. The frosted snow on the leaves still weighs upon me, growing from the same shallow, narrow water. We strive to stand erect on a hollow green stem, extending toward a more genuine solid space. I know we cannot depart from this world and its language, but neither would we follow it. When we are silent, there will still be noise, each abiding the season's dust, listening attentively. And as we unfurl, sensing the colors of distant waters. Now, this next poem, now I think I gave this one to you, William, did I? This one is a very personal one because it was written for myself and my wife and about our home in France, which PK came to visit more than once. So if you could read it first. Go ahead.
晨起信步走到屋後的空地，看林間掛的吊床，暖玉的木屋，繞屋而行，看見了另一個小小的露台，另一道門，樓梯通向另一個暗角，參差的稜角隨見者的心思轉型。30年前，一個年輕的嬉皮想在世外牧羊，要把廢棄的羊欄脫胎換骨，保留了不知通往哪兒的階級，卵石砌出了龍骨，憑空添了閣樓，無窮的空間有待年月來填充。如今的主人又再添了中國的禪雅，在藍發葡萄的夜晚，翻譯山東的狐仙。今日書城桌上，一眾圍坐屋外喝茶。黃昏在花園裏望見牆外山頂的餘暉，畫葡萄的孩子會長大。睿智的長者期待歲月下一輪豐盛的收穫。太陽很好，今年的雨水有點不夠，豪雨的時候屋子又會水淹了。有人去通渠了嗎？女主人打點晚餐，挪動桌椅的坐向，等房子如好酒醞釀成熟，可真不容易。
Thank you. House in the valley. Rising at dawn, I stroll to the empty space behind the house. I see a hammock slung between trees, a little sauna shed. Skirting the house, I reach another terrace, another door, a staircase leading to yet another hidden corner, ragged creepers rambling along the builder's heartlines. 30 years ago, a young hippie dreamt of being a shepherd somewhere beyond the dusty world. He decided to rebuild this ruined sheep pen, keeping the old stone stairs to who knows where. Ancient fossils jut from the steps, dragon bones leading to an upper room suspended in the void, an infinite space awaiting the fullness of time. The new master has added Chinese roof tiles. Here in the vineyards of the Midi, he translates tales of fox spirits from the distant Chinese hills. Today we sit together outside in the courtyard, drinking tea, his books piled high on the table. At dusk, I watched the last rays of the sunset gild the hilltops beyond the garden wall. One day the child painting grapes will be a man. The wise elders wait for the rich harvest to ripen on the wheel of time. The sun is so fine. This year the rains were too few, and then the floods came and the house was awash. Can someone unblock the drain? The lady of the house prepares the evening meal, sets out table and chairs. How hard it is waiting for a house to mature like a vintage. PK came twice to stay with us in our house in France, and I think it's appropriate to show you a couple of photographs of that wonderful place, which unfortunately I haven't been able to visit for the last 2 years, for reasons which I think you'll understand. And I've listed up the last few lines. I'm sorry. This is the end of the poem. That night I slept beside the grand piano, happy to have found a corner to lay my weary traveler's head. He did sleep next to the grand piano. Strolling at dawn up the hillside behind the house, I turned to gaze at the row of trees, at the windbreak protecting your home. And this is the place. You can see the trees, you can see the house, the vineyard. This is the place in the middle of winter. And even in winter, the skies are blue, and it's the most glorious part of France, the Languedoc. And this is the front courtyard where we sat drinking tea and talking about this, that, and the other. Of course, for personal reasons, I like that poem very much. I also think it's it reminds me of the great Tang poet Bo Juyi, because it's very casual, it's very light verse, and based on, it's just a poem written for a friend, but I mean, it's still a wonderful poem and worthy of preservation. You can see the persimmons on the tree ripening there in the front courtyard. Now this is, I think we might have to leave this one out because time is sort of running away with me. So unfortunately, I think this poem called The Bronze Mirror, which I think I gave to you, William, I think we'll have to leave it out. It's too long. We don't have time. Instead, let's move on to Sushi for Two, because I think Sushi for Two is wonderful, and it shows another side of PK. He loved writing poems about usually somewhat failed personal love affairs or relationships, certainly always very subtle ones. And most of his stories are about the same thing, you know. But this particular one, I think, is particularly beautiful. And if you could read the Chinese, William, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
我好想成為包裹你的海苔，你可願意圍繞我笨拙的形狀？你能否容忍我滿身鮮明的海膽卵？我愛你也得連起墨魚、青瓜和蟹柳。無數過去的飯團回來擾亂我們尋找自己。清茶還是清酒，又在千百個路口上彷徨。我嘗試接近你的柔韌。捉到了隱藏的尖刺，是你軟殼放蟹似蜘蛛的手足，向我要求甜蜜。
I think this is the last part. Yeah, sorry.
褪去了層層外衣，你停下來，我似感到了戰慄，接近捲曲的核心，好似冒犯了隱藏的苦澀。不認識自己的氣味，我的生聲竟也疏遠了你。不過是舒展自己，你的辛辣還是傷害了我。沉默了銅牌在碟子上，也形同陌路。交談嗎？胃中不覺又翻出無窮的宿怨。沒有了愛，傍晚進食只剩下物質的消耗，無所依歸。難道可信的只有甲利的靈魂？來自不同的城市，各自經過不同的冬天，欣賞彼此亮麗的顏色，為什麼總難燙貼？我慢慢咀嚼，逐漸消化你軟海的纖維。你在喧囂中靜止，我在你的舌頭上融化。
Thank you. I'm afraid a line or two got left out of the English, of the Chinese there. I corrected it on your version, William, but not on the PowerPoint. Here's the translation. sushi for two. I seem to be the seaweed wrapped around you. Can you accept the embrace of my clumsy form? Can you stomach the bright sea urchin eggs all over my body? Loving you, I must love the squid, the cucumber, the crab meat. Countless rice rolls from the past return to disturb us as we search for ourselves. Green tea or sake? Hesitating at 1,000 crossroads, reaching for you where you are soft and sinewy, I encounter hidden thorns. Your soft-shelled crab claws, like spider's legs, seek sweetness from me. Shedding layers of clothes, you pause. I seem to shudder. Coming near the coiled core is like touching a hidden pain. I don't know my own flavor. My rawness drives you away, but you carelessly unfold. Your pungency hurts me. We are silent, lying side by side on the dish like passing strangers. A word or two exchanged, but our stomachs heave with old grievances. Without love, evening meals are mere consumption of matter. Without a home, is the soul of a clam the only trusty shelter? From different cities we come, from different winters. We enjoy each other's bright colors. So why is love so hard? I chew slowly, gradually digesting the filaments from your deep ocean. In the loudness, you are still. I melt on your tongue. One of PK's great loves, and in fact, one of his great obsessions was food and drink. He really liked to drink and he loved to eat. And he was a very adventurous consumer of both food and drink. And I'm happy to say I shared many of them, many evenings with him doing precisely that. Now, there's another one here, which I don't think I've given you the Chinese for, but I don't think I'll read it because time is really running out. I want to go on to this poem, which it illustrates the light-hearted side of PK. And I want to read it because it was a wonderful occasion. On many occasions, I worked with PK in live situations, in events. I mean, he was a poet who liked to be part of the Hong Kong scene. And on this occasion, he worked with a very talented designer called Wessie Ling. There she is. She's now living in England and teaching avant-garde fashion design at Cumbria University. I think she's now in London. Anyway, she put together a show with PK at the Hong Kong Visual Arts Center, a sort of fake fashion show where she designed some outrageous costumes made mostly out of sacks and chains. It was a kind of takeoff of the fashion world. And then close to the date, PK said to me, would I get all the poems translated for him? He gave me about 2 weeks' notice. So I got all my students involved and we produced the translations of his poems, which were hilarious. And then a few days before, he said, John, we haven't got any models. We need some models for the show. Got any ideas? So I said, well, what about my daughter? She was a teenager. She was at the French school. So my daughter and all her friends were delighted to come and be models for the day. And in the morning, they were made up. They had their hair done by all the top fashion outfits in Hong Kong. And they were dressed up and they wore all these chains and sacks and things. And there was a hilarious catwalk kind of show, which was taking the mickey out of fashion, really. And PK wrote a number of, this is in the program, he wrote a number of poems about it, one of which was called Barbie Doll. And it's just a light-hearted poem. I'm a Barbie doll in a Barbie city. I wear a Barbie wig, put on a different Barbie suit every day. I've got a plastic home, a prefab Barbie office, and a group of very Barbie friends. Candlelit dinners to the accompaniment of the usual dazzling fireworks display over the harbor. I send Barbie flowers on Barbie Day, jot down the date of the next Lane Crawford sale, check out other people's clothes during happy hour, then go home to watch Barbie TV, Hong Kong Today. I really like that actor with the flat haircut in the series, the way he tilts his head and says in such an authoritative voice, the situation this year can be summed up in 2 words. Straight or gay, male or female, true or false, black or white, things like government benefit, unemployment, compensation. Best not to be so complicated. Being happy is the thing. I'm a Barbie doll walking in a Barbie park. I love plastic flowers in bloom, the pool packed with little sailing boats, dragon head, lion head, all decorated with the Bauhinia flower, Barbie logo, Barbie flag. I'm a Barbie doll walking into a Barbie Yao-Han department store, bringing home everything on the shelves, buying lots of useless cutlery and 70 different pairs of shoes for every possible occasion, investing in stocks, buying property. Ken's always at the other end of my cell phone saying, you're not happy, let's go party together. Yeah, let's go have some fun. The papers will always put you in the picture. I'll take a Barbie sauna, use my supermarket VIP card. I'll join in a spread it around the world, whole city rumor. Where should we have fun tonight? Shabu Shabu sounds rather nice. I'm a Barbie doll. I have all over plastic surgery from time to time. I don't mind changing my image. The thing is to be trendy. Smaller breasts, smaller hips, less and less makeup. Pull in those pouting lips. What's the big deal? If Young Generation magazine says so too, I follow this season's Milan fashions. The male models in foreign ads really grab me. I just love those PLA hunks. I fancy any man in a uniform. Their leather boots really turn me on. I'm a Barbie doll visiting a Barbie Legco. They're all sitting there so properly debating serious Barbie problems with Barbie procedures in Barbie language. I feel totally at ease, strolling happily down the street. I'm so glad to be living in a Barbie city. I think that's a wonderful poem. It says so much about Hong Kong, and it's a kind of, a poet like W.H. Auden was not ashamed to write light verse like that, nor was P.K. And although that poem very seldom gets included in his anthologies, I think it's a wonderful poem, and it's part of the real PK. And now I think this will probably be the last one I can read. It's a simple poem about a woman picking cress in the water. And it was very late in his life. PK was very influenced by the Shijing. He went back to the classics. He went back to Liao Zhai Zhi. He went back to the Shijing, and he wrote this poem about a simple poem about a lady growing cress in the New Territories. And I don't have time to read it because really time is running out. But he sent it to me on an occasion when we went up into the hills at Tai Mo Shan, and there he is, PK, with his wife Betty and me with my wife, and we went to this wonderful tea house up in the hills, and we had lovely yamcha, and in this place all the men from the local village came with their birds, and this particularly pleased PK. He loved going there. It was one of his favorite places actually. And we spent the most magical morning up in the hills. He was already very, very ill with lung cancer, but up on the mountain, he could breathe the fresh air. He was so happy. And we spent the whole morning there looking at the birds and drinking tea. And I think I'll end with this simple poem which he wrote for me about thinking of John at year's end, because he'd heard that we had some serious floods in France. A cold wind rises from the edge of the sky. How is the sky on your side? Oh, it's a misprint. On your side of the world. I heard you were ravaged by floods, lost quite a few books. Living in the mountains has its challenges, water gushing from sheer cliffs. I envy you, removed from these stacks of papers. No more endless meetings for you. No need to approve meaningless proposals or deal with bureaucratic documents and memos. There will be sunshine again after the rains. Rachel and Laura will make new friends, won't they? Your olive trees will bear fruit again, won't they? You are closer to China from having left China. Your highlands and crags open up magnificent vistas. Perhaps there by your lamplight, you can summon more intensely ghosts from Pusung Ling's strange tales. You live in the sun of the Midi. I sit here in the pall of smoke and dust that covers this island. When can we once more share a bottle of red wine and sit at a table going over lines of poetry again? It's such a timeless sort of Chinese poem that I was very touched when he sent me that. I think I'll have to move on because as usual, I provided much too much material. But this photograph really captures PK in a kind of performance mode. He loved to go and read poetry with his friends, musicians, and he loved to collaborate with other artists, and he loved to welcome visiting poets. Here he is with Gu Cheng and his wife, when they passed through Hong Kong. A man of incredible generosity of spirit, a very, very open-hearted, generous man. And he liked working with fashion designers. He asked me to translate a piece of his about William Tang, who was a great fashion designer, very avant-garde fashion designer, who was fascinated by the work of that mad street calligrapher called the King of Kowloon. And he dressed up as one of his models in a kind of reproduction of all of this man's calligraphy. And there's William again, one of the first openly gay designers in Hong Kong. And there's the King of Kowloon, who painted his mad calligraphy everywhere on every street post, every part of Hong Kong. He's become a very trendy person now. And this is Kung Chi Sing, the violinist, who was one of PK's great friends. One of the most moving experiences in my life was at the funeral of PK, which I was very honored to speak at. And during the funeral, Kung Chi Sing came and sat down up at the front and improvised the most moving lament on his violin for his very dear friend who passed away so young. And this is the dancer Mu Chuk Yin, who also collaborated with PK. PK collaborated with every kind of artist, and she's still one of the leading figures in the Hong Kong world of contemporary dance. He also wrote more traditional things like short stories, and I was involved with the first book of translations, really, of his short stories called Islands and Continents. And the last line of one of his really best stories, I think, called Post-Colonial Affairs of Food and the Heart. This last paragraph, I think, really captures his incredible mood, his combination of indomitable cheerfulness and great and deep-seated melancholy. It was, the two things went side by side with PK. So this is the very end of that quite long story. I went back to my seat and looked around me. I was so content to see this jumble of friends sitting around one big table, chatting animatedly with each other, happily drinking up the wine. Some have left us and gone to live elsewhere. New ones have joined us. This is a difficult time for us all. We have different views on every subject under the sun. We argue endlessly. Sometimes we hurt each other a bit, but somehow we manage to stay together. Maybe in the end, we learn to be kind to one another. The present situation, he's talking about the lead up to the handover. The present situation is no good for any of us. It's late at night now. Outside, the streets are empty and desolate, but we can still sit in here. We can still linger a while amid the lights and voices, drawing on the illusion of this warm and joyous moment. That's the very last paragraph of quite a long story. And then recently, we in the new series, we included two of his stories in a book which I entitled Dragons. And it's particularly poignant for me because there are two characters in the story who are based on myself and David Hawkes, who PK met at my house in France. And the two of them sat there all morning talking, and they immediately struck up a very close friendship. And he turns David, there's David, he turns David into the mentor of the main character of the story, who is called Maître Profond. Wu Wai Da Shi, I call him Maître Profond. And then he calls me a Changxing Daoren. I become Brother Clarity, and I'm his old Taoist friend living in southern France. So we become part of his story. I was very, very touched by that. Apparently, I'm leading a reclusive life studying old Chinese tales. Actually, I wasn't leading a reclusive life at all, but still, he likes to romanticize about that. We polished off a bottle of red wine and sat chatting about certain subtleties and allusions in our favorite classical texts. And we took part in many events together. I mean, we went to London together in 1997 and did a two-man show at the South Bank, which was great fun. We had so much fun. And there was a wonderful poetry evening at a bar in a place called Habitus in the Western Market. That was in 2005. But there were countless occasions like this. He was a very active participant in the Hong Kong cultural scene. And then to kind of bring the whole thing to a climax, in 2011, during my last stay of 2.5 years in Hong Kong, he organized a symposium on translating Hong Kong. And he asked me to give the opening address. I was very honored. And out of that sprang the whole project to translate and publish 6 books of Hong Kong literature, which I'm very happy to say has now been completed. And at the end of that day of the symposium, we went to a place called the Lok Cha Tea House, a beautiful old-fashioned tea house just near the park above Pacific Place. And we read poetry aloud, and then we had a wonderful meal. And here's the master of the tea house, who is a personal friend of PK's, an absolute connoisseur of Chinese tea, wonderful man. And this is a superb setting of the tea house. And they always have musical performances on Sunday. A magical place. Now, I think I'm probably going to stop there because I've got more, but I think time is running out. And I want to leave you with the thought of PK at this tea house at the very evening of this symposium that led to the series of Hong Kong literature translations, which I have been editing in the past 10 years, and leave you with the thought of that. And I think at the very end, I've got a brief statement, which I'd like to skip through. I'm going to have to leave out this wonderful, yes, at the symposium, I quoted this wonderful paragraph from the Orchid Pavilion preface by Wang Xizhi. And because for me, the highest aspiration of translation is friendship, is the communion of souls. It's the way that one person can see through the text into the soul of another person, whether that person be Pu Songling, Cha Xueqin, Zhuangzi, who cares, Bo Juyi, or in this case, Ye Si, Ya Si, PK. And I think that this has been a constant theme of Zhiyin throughout the whole history of Chinese culture. And it's most memorably expressed in this wonderful preface for this gathering of people at the Orchid Pavilion. And this is how it was translated by my dear friend Wang Xiu-Kit. In men's relationships with one another, in their journey through life, some become friends because they share certain aspirations and can talk together within the confines of a room. Some are friends because they find natural objects with which to identify their feelings and choose to abandon themselves beyond the limitations of their physical form. Friends may have an infinite variety of tastes, with some enjoying tranquility and others going for the hustle and bustle. But when they happily discover each other, in which discovery they also find themselves, they are overjoyed and forget that old age will inevitably descend among them. It's almost Proustian in its incredible philosophical and aesthetic summation of life. And for me, the recurring theme of translation is that its highest aspiration is that of friendship or of Zhiyin, the translator striving with his entire heart and soul to penetrate into the mind and soul of the person being translated. So I think I'll stop there and carry on next week with a further development of this theme. Thank you very much. Now, what do I do now? I think we have time for a bit of a chat. And I think last time the chats were quite fun. I have to go to the chat. I have to exit I have to stop sharing, and then have a look at the chat room. Anyone want to chat? Oh, here we are. I've already got some messages from somebody. Yes, an interesting comment by my friend Richard Rigby that maybe the Mudan poem should have been read in a northern Chinese, possibly. But I feel overwhelmingly obliged in this series to use Cantonese because it's so threatened, and it was so deeply part of PK's own vision of his poetic world that even with the Mudan poem, I think that it was probably appropriate to have it read in Cantonese. But thank you for that comment. Now, somebody else has asked that why did we abandon the project to translate Shejia Yingsun Duan? Good question. Originally when I signed up with Jin Yong in the first flush of my enthusiasm, I signed up to translate his entire work. I can't believe how stupid I was. I mean, one only has one life. Surely do something more interesting than that. Anyway, I very quickly, I had a very talented PhD student called Sharon Lai Ziyin, who's now teaching in Taipei at Shifan Daxue, a very clever girl. And she was the one who was going to do the rough draft of Shejia Ying Sun Duan. We were going to work together. I just think we lost it. I mean, it became the whole, as I think I've managed to try and tell you, the whole experience of translating for Jin Yong was a bit like being the court jester to Qin Shi Huangdi or something. You know, it wasn't a happy experience, and I don't think that it would have been. I think struggling through the whole of Shejia Ying Sun Duan would have been an absolute nightmare. And recently, Sharon wrote to me and said, "I'm so glad we never did it because it has now been translated in its entirety by two ladies, one of whom I know quite well." And it's a very valiant effort, but quite honestly, it's such a labor of whatever the opposite of love is, just a labor. And it's a novel that requires, and here I would have to go back, you know, and say to him, it needs a serious edit, you know. I had to reread it recently myself in order to advise some friends here who are working on a project. And I reread the whole novel and I thought, what a mess, you know, what an incredibly confused piece of writing. Just like David wrote in all his letters about our forgetful author. I mean, there are so many ways in which that novel needed a really good editor who was prepared to rewrite it, edit it, and reduce it to some sort of order. It's a sprawling, confused story that gets you completely lost and repeats itself again and again and again. And way back in the 1970s, a very fine French sinologist called Jacques Pampinot, who I'm very friendly with, went to see Jin Yong in Hong Kong and said he was interested in translating his books into French. But he said they would have to be very heavily edited and abridged. And Jin Yong just said, no way, you know, I'm not having my work abridged, you know, and that was the end of that. And I was only able to do what I did because I signed what I suppose you would call a translator's prenuptial agreement with him, in which he agreed to give me every right to do anything I liked. And I didn't actually take liberties, I just abridged. And but he wasn't happy with it. So I think if we'd gone ahead and done Shejia Ying Sun Duan, we would have had a horrible time. So that's the answer to your question. I've got about 10 more here. What would be an ideal relationship between the translator? I think I've already said that. I think it should be one of friendship. I think that working with a living translator, with a living author, I've worked with several living authors, and my relationship with PK was one of pure, unadulterated friendship and pleasure. We never had a bad time together. We had a wonderful time. We traveled around. We were together in London and so on and so forth. And it was the ideal relationship between a translator and an author, one of true friendship. And you know, if he found I'd made a mistake, he would point it out. But sometimes he'd say, "Actually, I like your mistake. I think I'll change the Chinese." You know, he had a sense of humor about himself. And so that would be my answer to your question. Most of these are just saying thank you, thank you, thank you. That's so kind of you to say thank you. Now, somebody here called Vicky, when you translate Jin Yong, what do you think is the most challenging part? Good question. I mean, most people think it would be the martial arts, the kind of wushu. Actually, I think that's dead easy. Westerners love a bit of, you know, Oriental martial arts, you know, flying dragon kicks the tiger in the bum kind of stuff. They love that stuff, you know. It's not, and Jin Yong just made the whole thing up. He can't do any martial arts to save his life. He just made it all up. So that's not difficult at all. What's difficult is keeping the story going, because he only wrote it 1,000 words at a time for a newspaper. So the readers would read 1,000 words and then they'd go on to the crossword puzzle or the racing results. And then the next day they'd read another. And therefore the book itself is very hard to keep going. That's why we abridged it. And basically I took a lot of liberties with the kind of style. I wrote it in a very racy sort of style. I wanted it to be a real fun read, you know. I think it still is. I think it succeeded, but it didn't please him. He wanted it to be far more, you know, he wanted me to do a literal translation. Because after all, why would he be interested in an English version? He wants to he can read his own Chinese, you know. He was a very poor judge of the English. Just as Marcel Proust was a very poor judge of Scott Moncrief's English translation of his great work. And I don't think authors should really interfere too much. They don't have the necessary qualifications to judge a translation. So I think the most challenging, if I was to be honest, the most challenging part about translating Jin Young was precisely what I've talked about: the need to intervene, the need to edit, the need to abridge, the need to mediate between him and his new readers in a sympathetic way. I mean, I have a huge admiration for the man. He was incredibly talented. He was bubbling over with energy and enthusiasm and fantastic imagination. He could create more and more plot, but he never forgave me for one critical comment I made about him at a conference. I said, the trouble with Jin Young, and nobody's supposed to criticize him, but I said, I'm afraid I don't believe in that. I said, the problem with Jin Young is that just when you want to have a deeper introspective study of the character of people, he'll make more plot. He'll create more complicated plot. So he's very clever at spinning more and more complicated bits of plot. And I'm afraid in English, it doesn't really work because the English reader loses interest. He manages to get away with it in Chinese because he writes such good Baihua. I mean, his Baihua one is spotless, you know. My friend Lawrence Wang Guobin once said to me, Jin Young is a perfect educational tool for secondary school children learning to read Baihua because he writes effortlessly good Baihua when, you know. And I think that's pretty much my, yeah. Oh, yes, somebody here, sounds familiar, yes, Xiao Shuang, about the Menglong poets, yes. I suppose, very simple, I mean, my life as a translator is always very closely linked to my personal life. I met, when I was in Tianjin in 1981, I met one of the younger Menglong poets, a man called Yang Lian, and I got to know him very well, and I was excited by the developments in the early 1980s in China with all these young poets like Bei Dao, Gu Cheng, Yang Lian, Jiang He, and so on. And it was very exciting at the time. It unfortunately led to a dead end, but I mean, it did start off very excitingly. And I became very friendly with Yang Lian, and I took him to conferences and we translated his poetry and so on. And that's how I got started. It was a very personal thing. And then later on, I met Gu Cheng and became very friendly with him. And it was a personal thing. I always, yes, that was pretty much that. Yes, are the two ladies Holmwood and Gigi? Yes, they are. That's a quick answer, yes. Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you, Richard. Yes, I think we're on the same page there. Somebody here called Li Hao, is it possible to share the recording? I think all these lectures are being recorded by Hang Seng, and they will be put on their YouTube channel. So it'll be a matter of a few months perhaps before they get up there, but they will all be on YouTube. Yeah. Oh, hello. This is hello, Ling Jie. Nice to hear from you. What do I think of the recently published translation? Oh dear, I don't want to comment. I think they did a jolly good job, but my goodness, I'd hate to try and do that myself. I tried reading it, I couldn't. I mean, you know, what can I say? Except that I don't want to be critical because they're very fine people and they're doing a good job. But it really is, translating Jin Young is a nightmare. Oh, can I disclose which chapters were translated by him? No, I can't. I want to keep that a secret to myself in case someone wants to attack me, and then I can just say it was done by David Hawkes. He did half, and I did half. I know which were done by him, and I know which were done by me. But I mean, apart from that one page which I shared, which says that he did the first chapter and I did the next three, which is pretty obvious, actually. I'm not going to reveal that, not right now. Oh, there's Esther telling us, yes, it'll be put on the website. Yeah, okay, there you go. Now here's somebody, Jin Yang. What do you think of the relationship between Hong Kong culture and, oh yes. Oh yes, I think I was asked a similar question last time. Of course, you can't separate Hong Kong cultural identity and Hong Kong literature. They're all part of the same thing. I mean, Hong Kong has a very, very strong identity. I always like to compare it with the country where I live, New Zealand. They were more or less founded in the same time in the 1840s, you know. And if anyone told New Zealand that their culture was part of British culture, they would probably kill you. You know, they have a very strong sense of New Zealand cultural identity, and New Zealand literature is part of that. Now, I think it's a simple thing. I think Hong Kong literature is part of the Hong Kong cultural identity. And Hong Kong is a small place, but my God, it's bigger than New Zealand. It's got half as many people again as New Zealand, you know. And Hong Kong has produced a unique culture. I mean, it is a very, very, very special place, and I'm extremely fond of it. And I'm very proud that I've been able to be a small part of it as a translator. And I think in the terms of world literature, what I hope is that eventually Hong Kong literature will be seen for what it is, a very special, very different kind of literature written in the Chinese language, but quite separate from both Taiwan and the mainland, and indeed Singapore. It's a very, very special literary identity, which is linked absolutely to its overall cultural identity. You see, in the West, people are very familiar with the films of Wong Kar-wai, for example. He has a place in world cinema, no question about it. You know, he's regarded as a great auteur. You know, his films, you may or may not like them, but I mean, they have an identity of their own. And the same is true of other Hong Kong film directors. You know, there are half a dozen of them who are well known in the world, and they're known for being Hong Kong directors, not Chinese. They're Hong Kong directors, and that's what I want the same thing to be true for Hong Kong literature, because I think it is true. I think PK is a Hong Kong poet first and foremost. And he certainly believed that himself. And he hated the way that the mainland wanted to sort of sweep Hong Kong underneath the mainland umbrella, because that's nonsense, you know. That's why it is different. And that was my great goal in trying to put this series together. I really hope we can continue to make the series bigger, you know, expand it in the future, because there's much, much more waiting to be translated, but it needs to be well translated. I mean, this project of ours took 10 years, you know, and I labored as an editor with every single manuscript. I went over every word of the thing, because I believed deeply in what I was, and I was doing it for my friend, you know, I was doing it as part of the legacy of my dear friend. And that's why I put my heart and soul into it. Yes, okay. When you say you intervene, sorry, somebody here. Right, yeah. A bridge is what? Oh, that's a hard one. Yes, I don't think I said I wanted to make it more introspective. I think what I said was that he sometimes doesn't allow himself time to develop interior character and psychology. Instead, he goes zooming off on more plot, you know, which he's brilliant at. I don't think I want to intervene in that sense. I want to try to simplify it. I want to try and sort out the tangled web of his plots, because they don't. In Chinese, he keeps the reader going by the pure magic of his storytelling in Baihua. You know, you can't put it down. But I mean, in English, that doesn't work. You know, unless you're a master of the English language, which I'm not. So you have to try to you have to prune it, you have to abridge it, and try to make it easier for the English reader to get into that world without getting thrown off all the time by complex new plots, which don't really help. That would be I don't think I want to make it more introspective. I don't think you can make it more introspective. Now there's somebody here, what have I learned from being a translator? Oh my goodness. What is the best reward I've got from, well, I'm not going to be all terribly serious. I mean, I've had an amazing life. I've enjoyed myself no end. Of course, it's hard work. I mean, I still struggle with addiction the whole bloody time, you know, but I mean, it's given me so much fun, so much pleasure. And it's brought me in touch with some wonderful people, not just writers, but my students. I mean, I still have wonderful students in Hong Kong with whom I value my relationship very much, and friends who've been colleagues in the translation world. The translation world in Hong Kong is incredibly vibrant. It always has been. I don't always agree with other people, but in their views of how to teach translation. But I've had a wonderful. I've worked as a teacher, but I've managed to find a little creative niche within teaching, because translation is a creative activity, and it's one that I've really enjoyed sharing it with students and with the writers I've met. So I can only say that I may not have learned anything from it myself. I don't think I've become a better person or anything, but I've just had a lot of pleasure from it. I would say quite simply, the best reward I've had has been to discover the incredible riches of Chinese literature, whether it be the I Ching or Pu Sung Ling or whatever, and the incredible pleasure that I've had from entering into their world. For that I have to be eternally grateful. Anyway, let's move on. What's this? Thank you. Would you adopt different methods as compared with the mainland? What aspects of Hong Kong literature we pay attention to? I don't think translation differs much. I mean, of course, the actual literature differs, but the actual process of translation doesn't really differ much, whether you're translating Swahili or Chinese or Japanese or, Portuguese or whatever. I mean, it's about entering into the mind and soul of the writer you're translating. And then secondly, developing the skills in your own language. I can't overemphasize this. You have to really work hard. I still do every day. I mean, I have to work very hard to try and improve my written skills in the English language, because without those, I might as well give up, and that's what I think that applies to every kind of literature, whether it's the mainland or Hong Kong. Of course, the literature itself differs, but I don't think the method of translation is going to be different. I don't think so. And I think we should study Hong Kong literature as we study any other kind of literature, Gosh, there's a lot of questions here. I've got a lot of, somebody says, Sun Yingbin says, my books are different, and the books I've translated are different in style. Can I share my experiences? That would take about 5 days, I think, which was the most difficult to translate. My goodness. I think Liao Jai Zhi is incredibly difficult to translate, but so rewarding. I mean, every story in Liao Jai requires hours and hours and hours of thought, of contemplation, of research, and then of playing around with the English, because it's Pu Sung Ling played with his language so much, and I derive an enormous amount of fun out of working with Pu Sung Ling, and it's probably the most difficult thing I've ever translated. Frankly, the I Ching is a piece of cake compared to Pu Sung Ling, because the I Ching, you just enter into a kind of trance, really. I believe the I Ching to be a spirit, not a book. And in order to translate it, you have to communicate with that spirit. That's a very controversial way of looking at it, but that's the way I do. And each book has been different. And I've derived a huge amount of satisfaction from translating the Tao Te Ching, because I think it's a very, very powerful and special book. And my translation hasn't pleased everybody. I knew it wouldn't, because I wanted it to sing. I really felt I got to the idea of how to translate the Tao Te Ching when I was staying in a Benedictine monastery in Rome, and I heard Gregorian plain chant being sung morning, noon, and night, and it entered into my ears, and I just thought, yes, that's what I want the Tao Te Ching to sound like. I want it to be singable. I want it to be a hymn, a chant in praise of the Tao, which I think it is. My own guess is that these were probably hymns that were sung at Taoist gatherings, But I mean, so I think almost every book I've translated, I've certainly learned from. I wouldn't say I've always enjoyed them, but I mean, I've always derived some kind of pleasure. Anyway, okay, let me see if there's anything else here. Oh, whether living in China helps. They always say that Arthur Waley never lived in China, therefore he couldn't possibly. What a lot of rubbish. I mean, he never went further east than Rome, apparently, but he translated Chinese wonderfully, because it's in the mind, He traveled in the mind. It was what they call traveling lying down, And I mean, I don't think living in China is necessarily it's not a necessary condition. I don't think so. No, I don't think living in the country is necessary at all. I mean, maybe it can help, but I don't think it's necessary. No. Oh dear. I'm writing an autobiography. Well, this is Xiao Shuang. I mean, I am writing it. I've already dictated it to a friend, and I've got a rough draft. But I mean, the trouble is that the more I think back to the past, the more I remember things, the more I want to say, and the more I realize I haven't really told the truth. I think writing one's own memoirs is a very difficult business, because you don't trust your memory. I can't trust my memory, and I try to dig deep. I try to go deep into the past. I try to understand why my life has turned out the way it has, and sometimes I simply can't, you know. So I'm still struggling with that project. It never leaves my mind every day. I've got a great pile of papers, and a very dear friend of mine has interviewed me for many hours and written the first draft, which is a great starting point. But I feel there's a great deal more to be said, and giving these talks, in fact, have been quite helpful, because a lot of it has been quite autobiographical. Oh dear, what's my favorite story? My goodness, that's a very hard one. I've got so many favorites. Yes, I do like Yeshan. It's a wonderful story, but I've been doing a whole new lot recently, and if you're interested and write to me, I can maybe send you one of them, because I particularly like one which I've called Blue Phoenix, and Ching Feng. It's a beautiful story. Absolutely haunting story. I mean, the trouble with Liao Jai stories is that you get into them and they really start to haunt you, you know. It is like entering into the dream world of somebody else, the unconscious. I always regard Liao Jai as a kind of guide to the Chinese subconscious. It really is an extraordinary collection of, they're not just, I mean, most of the films made based on Liao Jai are just rubbish. They're so stupid, chocolate box rubbish, you know. But if you get to grips with the original stories, and especially if you read the Chinese commentaries, which are wonderful, they're deeply, they come from a deep part of the Chinese consciousness, and that's why I think they're invaluable for an understanding of the human condition. I mean, I don't mean specifically Chinese, but the human condition in terms of love, in terms of infatuation, in terms of craziness, in terms of bizarre habits, bizarre behaviors. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. So anyway. Yes, I think we all do miss. This is another question from somebody. We all miss Yasi. There's no question about it. Well, I think that's pretty much brought us at 7. It's in New Zealand at 7:59, so that means it must be 3:59 in Hong Kong. So I think probably that's a good moment at which to wrap things up. So thank you all for your questions. You know, I was quite apprehensive about lecturing on Zoom, but because of the chat room, it's become quite real to me. I find that people say more in the chat room than they used to say in the real lecture hall, because especially in Hong Kong, people are quite reluctant to speak out. And but I find that the comments I've been getting in the chat room have been really fascinating, and have provoked me to you know, say some things myself, which I've been quite surprised by, actually. So I look forward to talking next time. I'm going to talk next time about what I call the BG tradition in modern Hong Kong literature. And I'm specifically going to talk about Xixi and about the memoir written by my friend Leo Li and his wife Esther, called Guo Pingchang Rizi, which is a wonderful book, and other things, 2 little essays by people. I want to emphasize that this BG tradition, what's sometimes called Xianjing Wenxue, the literature of sentiment, is such an important part of Chinese literature, and it has survived untouched in Hong Kong, whereas it really hasn't survived untouched in the mainland, you know, because it doesn't serve the people, I'm afraid. And you know, who gives a tuppenny halfpenny raspberry for that? You know, it's wonderful stuff, and I'm going to talk about that next time. So I look forward to being back with you next time. Thank you very much. I think I'll now press the button that says leave, and wish you all a very good week. And oh, hi, William. Nice to hear from you. So nice to see lots of friends of mine on here. It's very pleasant, I must say. Okay. Well, it wasn't deliberate. I just happened to end on exactly the right moment. So take care, all of you, and maybe see some of you next week. Bye-bye.